KBOO 90.7 FM.
When I'm in Portland,
from KBOO. Check it for 90.7 KBOO.
Eliza Yurkov scene, take one.
My name is Eliza Yurkov, and outside of KBOO, I am a habitat restoration specialist, as well as a GIS technician. I started in the newsroom last year around March, and the show I was working on was the evening news. I was producing and anchoring for the news, so I would spend around 6 to 8 hours a day collecting stories from all across the nation and the world, and local stories as well, and curating them for a half-hour news show. It was really exciting, and I learned a lot of critical thinking skills and critical analysis working on the news, where I was very pulled into wanting to report only positive stories, since there is so much negativity reported on. Not necessarily that the news stories are overly represented by negativity, but that there's an overwhelming reporting bias on negative and eye-catching headlines. So I had this really strong pull to only report on positive news, and I had to work really hard to ensure I was reporting as neutrally as possible to be an ethical journalist. It was a mild career path I hadn't totally considered when I was younger, but it was something I was really excited to explore, and through that lens, I understood the power that I had in delivering important news stories to an audience for just a half-hour segment, that for those 30 minutes, people were paying attention to what I was saying. And so I had to be very concerned and intentional about what I was reporting, not just what I wanted to report on. I have an eye for positivity. I find myself a chronic optimist. So using different sorts of news aggregates like Feedly and other kind of algorithmic based news collection sources, including my dad, who also follows news very closely, I was able to find all sorts of positive news stories that I could kind of interject into the loud cacophony of other maybe negative or even just neutral, maybe even slightly boring news stories. My favorite news story that I ever reported on was actually from Massachusetts, I believe, and it was about a baby beaver who was rescued by a wildlife refuge. And in the state of Massachusetts, you're not allowed to keep any sort of species for longer than like a certain amount of time, just to ensure that they're returned back into the wild. But this little beaver didn't want to go back into the wild. She refused all attempts to re-wild her. And so there was this huge Facebook campaign to keep her at the wildlife refuge despite the law, and the governor got involved, and it was just a really fascinating uproar from a community for a charismatic mini fauna. Last year, I was in a strange moment in my life where I was reconsidering everything I was doing. And I had many careers before this moment, and I was at this interjection point where I was trying to decide what next adventure to embark on. I had recently gained a position with this news aggregate app startup that eventually kind of petered out, but it really inspired this sense of wanting to report and tap into some journalistic skills. And I was looking around for volunteer opportunities in Portland. I had some extra hours on my hand and I wanted to give back to the community. And so I truly just typed in community volunteer into Google on a late night search when I couldn't fall asleep. And KBOO was one of the first things that popped up. I had heard about this radio station many times. I've lived here since 2019 and I never really tapped into KBOO. And I thought, I wonder what their volunteer opportunities look like. And then I see that it's completely volunteer powered and there was just a complete open space for newcomers to come in and really sink their teeth in right away. There was a low barrier to entry to get involved, and that was really exciting. So I reached out to the volunteer coordinator, Nate, and we got set up with some trainings, and I came in to tour the studio, and I fell in love pretty immediately. I had never worked at a radio station before. It felt like such an abstract kind of mystical concept to work in radio. And so being able to do something that I had just never even entertained as something I could do was just like a really kind of powerful pull. I was originally going to try to curate my own show. It was going to be about positive news stories in conjunction with the monthly full moons. It's still a work in progress because when I talk to people about it, they say it's very interesting. I'm like, well, once it gets written, it might be. But talking about news stories, I ran into Althea, the news director, and she said, well, we could use some writers in the room. And I said, great. So I started out writing for the news, and there were a bunch of anchor openings, and she had me read, and she said that it sounded great. So I started writing and anchoring, and one day she was like, do you want to produce the news? And I said, yes. And so it just was this kind of cascade of opportunities that led me to really have such a stronghold in the newsroom. And eventually I was able to take out some recording kits and go do some outside interviews. I went to the Fermentation Fest last year, and I interviewed the mascot for the Portland Pickles, Dylan the Pickle, which is funny because he doesn't talk. That was really exciting to, be able to talk to small Portland businesses in a way that felt very productive. I have just really fallen in love with being in this world that brings people together in an intentional way for a purpose, but there's so much more relationship building that happens outside of that purpose as well. I love that KBOO is mostly 90% volunteer powered. It feels so important that the people who are involved in this organization are here truly by their own volition and come back and report or DJ or come to just speak into a mic to thousands of listeners just because they want to. That feels like such an important element of community building, is that what you're getting out of it is the relationships that you're building rather than some sort of compensation. Journalism and any sort of work absolutely do need to be compensated. At the same time, there are these roles in community that just need people to do them. And the fact that KBOO offers this space for people to do that is really beautiful. Community radio specifically is so important because I keep talking about bringing people together, but also it's important that we have a source of news and media and art that comes from the people who are in the community that they're reporting for. Hearing international music and national music, and international news stories and national news stories are important for us to stay connected and current and understanding the rhythms and trends of the world. It's just as, if not more important, to be as locally tapped in as possible, because that's where small and the most impactful change comes from. So having a news station that reports specifically on the place that it is in is critical to listener buy-in, to building lasting and meaningful relationships within the radio station, as well as outside of the radio station with their listeners. As I said, it's important for community to have roles that aren't necessarily compensated, but are still fulfilled. Volunteer work is a critical piece of maintaining a community. At the same time, we live in a society where money makes things go, and without some sort of financial backing, things tend to fall apart. And without, a news director that's paid, a volunteer coordinator that's paid, these more permanent and full-time, if not extra full-time positions, without these positions being paid positions or dissolving into a volunteer nature, or even becoming decentralized with many people working on them, that's where the radio station can fall apart and just cease to exist. And without something like KBOO, it's not just that we're losing something to listen to, we're losing a piece of Portland's history, a piece of Portland's culture, and a piece of what makes something local. There are so many different podcasts and news stories and news stations and ways to listen to music that are so condensed and centralized that have no buy-in to the community. And without something that has been built by the community, it's kind of like, what's the point of living anywhere if everywhere looks the same? And something like KBOO is so specific to Portland. There are tons of community radio stations throughout the nation and throughout the world, and those radio stations make those places so specific as well. There's so many different things that make a place, and when you start to lose those things, what else do you have? And something like KBOO is such a bastion of what makes Portland. It really flattens the experience of being tapped into the news or being tapped into different kinds of music. It turns into this algorithmic, homogenous soup that listening to any news story feels just as impactful as listening to any other news story. There's nothing that's like decided on. There was no like intention behind it. Something like KBOO, without this kind of radio station, it dissolves the community that literally comes to this specific tangible space, as well as the more abstract and kind of conceptual listening space that it takes up as well. Centralized news sources are dangerous. When there is one or two sources of news, those people in power control what listeners are tuned into and what they know and how they know it. No journalist writes without some sort of bias or slant. So having a diverse and wide array of journalists is critical in capturing every aspect of a story so that a listener or reader can fully understand what is going on in the world. When there is a lack of that diversity, there's a lack of understanding. Tuning in and supporting local radio stations or just any public radio station or media outlet is critical in maintaining that diversity and maintaining the pursuit of capturing every side of the truth possible.